Clara had just returned from work, her shoulders heavy from another long day in Seattle. The city outside was alive with its usual rhythm cars rushing past. Psst. People lost in their own stories, but inside her home, everything felt still. She kicked off her shoes, hung her coat, and walked upstairs to her bedroom. The late afternoon sun streamed through the curtains, filling the room with a warm glow. She paused for a moment, gazing out of the window, letting the silence soothe her. Life hadn't been simple in years. Since her divorce, the house had felt empty, though she never admitted how much that loneliness weighed on her. Her son, Ethan, had come home from college only a few weeks ago. At 19, he wasn't the boy she remembered. He had grown taller, his shoulders broader, his features sharper. He carried himself with a calm confidence that made him look older than his age. Clara often caught herself staring at him, surprised at how much he had changed in such a short time. It was a strange feeling, learning to see him not as her little boy, but as a young man who was finding his place in the world. That afternoon, she stepped into her room and began to change out of her work clothes. She wasn't expecting anyone to come in. Ethan usually spent his afternoons out with friends or on his laptop in his room. Without thinking, she pulled her blouse over her head and tossed it on the bed. The air felt cool against her skin, and she turned toward her dresser to reach for a fresh shirt. At that very moment, the door creaked open. Ethan stood there, framed by the doorway. For a split second, neither of them moved. Clara froze, caught in a moment she hadn't prepared for. She wasn't indecent, but the intimacy of the scene, the quiet light, the sudden closeness made her heart race. Ethan's eyes widened in surprise, and he quickly stepped back, his voice stumbling out. "Sorry, Mom," he said, almost too fast, as if trying to escape the weight of what he had just seen. But before he left, Clara caught something in his gaze. It wasn't the innocent look of a boy accidentally walking into his mother's room. It was different, more complex, filled with emotions neither of them had words for. She couldn't explain why it struck her so deeply. She pulled her shirt on quickly, her hands trembling, while Ethan shut the door and disappeared down the hall. Clara stood still for a long moment, her heart beating louder than it should have. It was such a small thing, an accident, nothing more. But inside her, something shifted. The air in the room felt charged, as if a hidden truth had suddenly revealed itself. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. "He's your son," she told herself. "Don't overthink this." But when she went downstairs later, she found herself glancing at him differently. Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone. The soft light from the window fell across his face, highlighting the angles of his jaw, the quiet seriousness in his eyes. For years she had thought of him only as her child. Now, without warning, she was forced to confront the fact that he was no longer just that. He was becoming his own person, a young man she barely recognized. The rest of the afternoon passed in silence. But the memory of that moment in her room stayed with her. Every sound seemed sharper, every glance heavier. It was as though an invisible thread now connected them, pulling her thoughts toward places she didn't want them to go. Clara tried to push it aside, busying herself with little tasks, folding laundry, tidying the living room, checking emails. But the image of Ethan standing in her doorway refused to leave her mind. What unsettled her wasn't what had happened, but how it made her feel. She wasn't supposed to notice the hesitation in his eyes, the way his voice had trembled when he apologized. She wasn't supposed to feel her heart leap, wasn't supposed to wonder what he had seen in her that made him pause before leaving. It was all wrong, and yet it was real. And denying it only made the truth press harder against her chest. By evening, the house seemed different. Nothing had been said, but something had been broken open. The walls felt closer, the air heavier. And Clara knew with quiet certainty that the days ahead would not be the same. Dinner that night felt strangely heavy. Clara moved around the kitchen, stirring pasta on the stove, chopping vegetables, and setting the table with practiced motions. She tried to convince herself that everything was normal, but her hands betrayed her. She dropped a spoon, fumbled with a plate, and each clatter felt louder than it should have. She told herself she was just tired. But deep down she knew the truth. Her mind was stuck on the moment from earlier, the one she couldn't erase. Ethan came down quietly, his footsteps slower than usual. He sat at the table, phone in hand, pretending to scroll, though his eyes lifted every so often toward his mother. When Clara finally placed the food on the table, she forced a smile and said, "Eat before it gets cold." Ethan gave a small nod, but the silence between them stretched like a rope pulled too tight. She tried to break it. "So, how was your day?" He shrugged. "Fine. Just worked on some assignments." His voice was calm, but his eyes didn't meet hers. He focused on his plate, twirling pasta as if it required all his attention. Clara nodded, though her chest ached at the distance. Normally, Ethan loved talking about his classes, his friends, the new things he was learning at college. Tonight, he kept his words short, careful. Clara laughed lightly, trying to ease the tension. "You're too quiet. You used to never stop talking when you were little." That earned the smallest smile from him, but it faded quickly. "Things change," he said softly, almost like a whisper. The words cut deeper than she expected. She wanted to say something more, to tell him she missed their old rhythm, but the weight in the room made her tongue heavy. Instead, they ate in silence. The clink of forks, the only sound filling the space. After dinner, Clara busied herself with the dishes. She could feel Ethan's presence behind her as he lingered in the kitchen doorway. The quiet stretched on until finally his voice broke through. "You don't have to act like nothing happened." The plate in Clara's hand almost slipped. She steadied it quickly, her breath catching in her throat. "What do you mean?" she asked carefully, though she knew exactly what he meant. Ethan shifted, his expression unreadable. "Earlier, I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to walk in on you, but you don't need to hide from me. I mean, we're both adults now. It's not a big deal." Clara turned, meeting his eyes. His tone was casual, but the way he said adults carried a weight she couldn't ignore. Something unspoken lingered beneath his words, and it left her uneasy. She wanted to brush it off, to laugh and tell him not to worry. But she couldn't. The seriousness in his gaze held her still. She forced a gentle smile. "It's fine, Ethan. Let's just forget it happened." But his eyes stayed on her, steady and unflinching. For a moment, she felt exposed, not because of what he had seen, but because of what was passing between them now. A current, subtle but powerful, ran through the silence. She turned back to the dishes, pretending not to notice. Though her heart beat wildly in her chest, Ethan didn't say anything more. He just nodded and went upstairs. The sound of his footsteps faded, leaving Clara alone in the kitchen. She leaned against the counter, gripping the edge as if it could steady her. She had expected him to laugh it off, to dismiss it with the careless ease of youth. Instead, his words had unsettled her, as though he had seen something in her she wasn't ready to face. Later that night, Clara lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, but her mind was not. She thought about Ethan's words. We're both adults now. He wasn't wrong. He was 19, no longer a boy, but the truth of it made her uneasy. He had spoken with a seriousness that didn't fit his age, and she wondered what else was hidden behind those words. Her thoughts wandered to the past, to the years after her divorce when Ethan had been her anchor. He had seen her at her weakest, had comforted her when she cried silently in the kitchen at night. He had been her reason to keep going. Somewhere along the way, he had grown into a man, and she hadn't noticed until today. The realization was overwhelming. She turned on her side, closing her eyes tightly, willing sleep to come. But instead, she replayed the look in his eyes when he spoke at the kitchen doorway. It wasn't just concern. It was something else, something she couldn't name but couldn't ignore. It made her heart ache with confusion, a mix of fear and longing she didn't want to admit. The house felt too quiet, as if it was holding its breath. Clara wrapped the blanket around her, trying to shut out the thoughts that refused to leave. She told herself it was just an accident, just an awkward moment that any family could experience. Tomorrow, things would go back to normal. Tomorrow, she would laugh at herself for overthinking. But deep inside, she knew tomorrow wouldn't be the same. Something had already shifted. One look, one conversation, and the ground beneath her feet no longer felt steady. She didn't know where this invisible road was leading, but she knew one thing for certain. Life inside that house had changed forever. The next morning, Clara moved through the house with careful steps. She poured coffee, folded the laundry, and opened the curtains as if routine could push away the thoughts from the night before. She told herself to focus on ordinary things, but her mind betrayed her. Circling back to Ethan's words, his steady gaze, the way silence had filled the house like smoke. She had lived through many kinds of silence in her life loneliness after the divorce. The quiet nights when Ethan was away at college, but this was different. This silence carried weight, as though unspoken truths were waiting to break free. Ethan came downstairs later than usual. Wearing a plain t-shirt and jeans, his hair slightly messy. Clara noticed, against her will, how much older he looked. She quickly pushed the thought aside and forced a smile. "Good morning. Coffee's ready?" He nodded, pouring himself a cup, but his eyes lingered on her just a second too long. They sat across from each other at the table, steam rising between them, neither finding the right words. Clara hated the distance but feared what honesty might bring. Finally, he decided she couldn't live in the tension any longer. She set her cup down and looked directly at him. "Ethan," she said softly, "about yesterday. I don't want things to feel strange between us." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "It's not strange. It just made me realize something." Clara's pulse quickened. "Realize what?" His eyes held hers, steady and serious. "That you're more than just my mom. You're someone I look up to, someone I admire, someone I care about in ways I can't really explain." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to tell him he was confused, that this was just a phase, that emotions sometimes played tricks, but her heart betrayed her. His voice carried such raw honesty that she couldn't dismiss it. The boy she had raised was gone. Sitting before her was a man speaking from someplace deeper than she was ready to confront. She opened her mouth, but before she could find the right words, the phone rang. The sharp sound cut through the moment like glass, shattering. Grateful for the interruption, she stood quickly and grabbed it. Her ex-husband's voice came through the line, casual and familiar. "Clara, I wanted to check in about Ethan," he said. "Have you talked to him about his transfer options? He's been on my mind. I just don't want him wasting time." Clara glanced at Ethan, who was watching her closely. She cleared her throat, forcing her voice to sound steady. "We've talked a little. He's still figuring things out. Well, make sure he doesn't drift. He needs direction," her ex continued, his tone half caring, half critical, the same tone that had worn down their marriage years ago. Clara murmured polite responses, all the while feeling Ethan's gaze on her like a spotlight. She ended the call quickly and set the phone down, her hands trembling slightly. The moment was broken, but the weight remained. Ethan leaned forward, his voice quieter now. "He still treats you the same way, doesn't he? Always telling you what to do, like you can't make choices on your own." Clara blinked, caught off guard. "It's complicated," she said. "No," Ethan replied firmly. "It's not. You deserve better than that." His words pierced her, not because of what he said, but because of how fiercely he meant it. Clara's chest tightened. She had spent years building walls around her heart, convincing herself that loneliness was safer than disappointment. But in Ethan's eyes, she saw no judgment, only a kind of protectiveness that both comforted and unsettled her. She wanted to change the subject, to steer them back to safer ground, but her voice faltered. "Ethan, he interrupted softly, his tone almost pleading. "I just don't want you to think you're alone. You're not." Her heart swelled, aching with emotions she didn't want to name. She reached across the table, resting her hand lightly on his. It was a simple gesture, something any mother could do, but the warmth that rushed through her felt dangerous. He didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand slightly, letting her touch linger. For a moment, the kitchen felt suspended in time, just the two of them bound by words left unspoken. Clara knew she had to break it before it went too far. She pulled her hand back gently, rising from the table. "I should get started on the laundry," she said quickly. her voice unsteady. Ethan didn't stop her, but his eyes followed her with a quiet intensity. As she moved into the next room, her hands shook. She folded clothes mechanically, trying to calm herself. But the conversation echoed in her mind. "You're more than just my mom. You're not alone." Those words weren't supposed to come from him, yet they had. And they had struck the very core of her heart by the time evening fell. Clara was exhausted not from chores, but from holding herself together. She stood by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, and wondered how everything had changed in just 2 days. Ethan's presence in the house no longer felt simple. Every glance, every word carried meaning. She couldn't ignore it, but she didn't know how to face it either. Upstairs, Ethan stayed in his room, the quiet hum of music seeping faintly through the walls. Clara lay in bed later that night, staring at the ceiling, knowing the conversation they had started was far from over. Words had been spoken that couldn't be taken back. Feelings had surfaced that couldn't be ignored. And though she told herself over and over to stay strong, she knew the truth. Something fragile and dangerous had awakened between them, and it was only a matter of time before they would have to face it. Rain pattered against the windows that evening, soft but steady, filling the house with a rhythm Clara couldn't ignore. She sat on the edge of her bed with a book in her hands, though she hadn't read a single line. Her eyes kept drifting to the door, her thoughts circling endlessly around Ethan. The air inside the house felt too still, as though both of them were waiting for something neither could name. A gentle knock broke her thoughts. She froze, heart racing, before calling out softly, "Come in." The door opened and Ethan stepped inside. He looked hesitant, almost nervous, his hands shoved into his pockets. He stood near the door for a moment, as though deciding whether to stay or go, then finally walked closer. Clara put the book down, bracing herself. "Mom," he said quietly, "I don't want to make things harder, but I can't keep pretending nothing's different." His voice carried a weight that made her chest tighten. Clara looked at him, her throat dry. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she already knew. "Yesterday, when I walked in, something changed," he admitted. "And it's not just about that moment. It's everything. I see you differently now. I can't explain it, but I feel it. And I don't know what to do with it." His honesty hung in the air, raw and unguarded. Clara's heart broke at his words. She wanted to be strong, to set boundaries, to remind him of the roles they carried. Yet as she looked into his eyes, she saw a young man searching for answers, not a child overstepping his place. She reached for his hand without thinking, her voice trembling. "Ethan," she whispered, "sometimes life puts us in moments we don't expect, but some lines, they can't be crossed. I love you more than anything, but that love has to stay safe. Do you understand?" His eyes glistened, and for the first time Clara saw how fragile he really was. He nodded slowly, though his hand lingered in hers as though he didn't want to let go. "I know," he said softly. "I just needed to tell you how I feel. I couldn't keep it inside." Tears pricked at her eyes, and she squeezed his hand gently before letting it go. "You're not alone in this house. You never will be. But we have to protect what we have, Ethan. Some feelings. They're too heavy to carry the wrong way." The rain outside grew stronger, tapping against the windows like a quiet reminder of time moving forward. Ethan sat beside her on the bed, his head lowered, his shoulders tense. Clara placed her hand on his back, offering comfort the only way she knew how. It wasn't the comfort of answers or promises, it was the comfort of presence, of staying near even in confusion. For a long moment they sat in silence, mother and son, yet bound by something deeper than either wanted to admit. It wasn't passion that filled the room, but a painful tenderness, the kind that comes when two hearts recognize they're standing too close to align. Eventually, Ethan stood, his voice low. "Thank you for listening. I just needed you to know." Clara nodded, forcing a smile through her tears. "And I'll never stop listening. But let's take one step at a time. Life will guide us if we let it." He gave her a small, grateful look before leaving the room, closing the door gently behind him. Clara sat in the silence that followed, her chest aching, her mind racing. Everything truly had changed. Not in the way she feared, not in the way that broke rules, but in the quiet realization that Levine, its purest, most complicated form had surfaced between them, she lay down, staring at the ceiling, the rain still echoing outside. She knew tomorrow would not erase what was said tonight. The bond between her and Ethan would carry a new layer, one shaped by honesty, restraint, and an understanding neither of them had expected. And though her heart was heavy, there was also peace. Love had found them in a strange and difficult way, but it had not destroyed them. Instead, it reminded her of something she had almost forgotten, that even in the hardest truths, love can still be gentle,